Its paint was peeling, its porch boards creaked, but inside, it carried the laughter and life of a family that refused to be broken. That morning, gospel music hummed from a small radio in the kitchen, Ruth humming along as she flipped cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her back, though bent with age, still carried the grace of a woman who had once marched for her right to vote. Nia, Caleb's younger sister, darted in and out of the kitchen, tugging on her school jacket, her voice full of teenage urgency as she asked Caleb for money for gas. Caleb teased her, sliding a folded 20 from his pocket, reminding her she'd owe him extra chores in the field. She rolled her eyes but kissed his cheek before running out the door. These little rituals, the warmth of cornbread, the quick banter, the soft light slanting across Ruth's face, anchored Caleb to the present. They were reminders of why he worked, why he endured. He had dreams bigger than the soil under his boots. Quietly, methodically, he was building towards something no one in Mason County expected from a sharecropper son. At night, after the fields were watered and the livestock fed, Caleb stayed awake under the dim glow of a desk lamp, poring over books on agricultural economics, soil science, and cooperative business models. The world saw him as just another black man in overalls, but he was armed with knowledge, sharpened with patience. He believed land was the key, not just for him, but for his community. Land meant power, dignity, and a future not borrowed from the hands of others. That morning, as he loaded crates of produce into the back of his old pickup truck, Ruth came outside and rested a hand on his arm. Her skin was soft but firm, her eyes steady. "Don't let this county change you," she said softly. "Your daddy had a temper. It broke him. You've got his fire, but you carry it different. You keep it steady." Caleb nodded, kissed her forehead, and climbed into the truck. He drove into town with the bed stacked high with collards, sweet potatoes, and jars of honey. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and exhaust as he pulled into the farmer's market. Mason County's market was a small but lively affair. Local families wandered in the rows, the chatter of neighbors, the sharp ring of the cash registers. Caleb parked at the edge, set up his stand neatly, and greeted folks with a quiet warmth that made people trust him. Children pointed at the jars of honey, elders asked about his grandmother, and young families admired his vegetables. For a brief while it was peace. The market was one of the few spaces where his work was visible, where people could see the fruits of his labor and treat him with respect. Yet, even here, a current of tension lingered. He could feel the eyes of certain townsfolk, the older white men in wide-brimmed hats who walked past without a glance, the store owners who looked at his produce but never bought, the whispers that trailed behind him. Caleb felt it. But he carried himself with the kind of composure that disarmed hostility. As the sun climbed higher, he caught sight of Caroline Whitfield across the square. She was the daughter of Judge Whitfield, the man who owned half the county's land and controlled the other half with his influence. Caroline stood out in her designer sunglasses, her manicured nails wrapped around a coffee cup, her laughter sharp and careless. Caleb watched her for a moment, then turned back to his customers. He had work to do. That morning felt like any other, but in Caleb's gut, a quiet unease stirred, the kind that comes before a storm. The market had settled into its rhythm by late morning. The smell of smoked ribs and fresh bread hung in the air. Children tugged at their mother's hands for kettle corn, and the buzz of easy conversation wrapped around the square. Caleb kept his focus on the steady line of customers drifting toward his booth. He was known for his greens, crisp, dark, full of flavor, and his honey always sold out before noon. Each sale, each smile of gratitude, was another quiet reminder that dignity could be cultivated, even in soil that had long been denied to people like him. But beneath that warmth, Mason County carried its own quiet hierarchy. You could hear it in the way certain voices dropped when black folks walked by, in the way doors closed just a little too quickly, in how police cruisers idled longer near the market's edge when Caleb's people gathered there. It wasn't spoken outright, not anymore. It lived in body language, in narrowed eyes, in who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. Caroline Whitfield emerged from a boutique across the square, the click of her heels sharp against the concrete. Even from a distance, she carried herself like the town belonged to her. She was dressed for a city runway, silk blouse, gold jewelry catching the sunlight, though Mason County's dust clung to everyone eventually. People shifted as she passed, some nodding politely, others watching with quiet envy or disdain. Her last name was enough to command the air around her. When her gaze landed on Caleb's booth, her lips curled into something halfway between amusement and contempt. She strode over, sipping her latte, her perfume cutting through the smell of soil and sweat. "Well," she drawled, eyes sweeping over the neatly stacked collards, the jars of honey lined like soldiers. "Isn't this cute?" The sharecropper's son, playing businessman. Her voice was sweet enough to drip, but loud enough that nearby vendors and customers glanced over. Caleb felt his shoulders stiffen, but he didn't raise his eyes from the scale. He was using to weigh a bundle of sweet potatoes. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield," he said evenly. His tone was steady, respectful even, but it carried no trace of deference. Caroline let out a light, mocking laugh. "Morning? Oh, bless your heart. You really think anyone in this county's ever going to buy from you when they can just get produce at Whitfield Grocers?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "My daddy says you people don't understand business. You just plant sweat and pray somebody pities you." Caleb lifted his eyes then, meeting hers. There was no anger, only a calm that unsettled her. "My customers seem to think otherwise," he said, sliding the bag of potatoes across the table to an elderly black woman who gave him an encouraging nod. Caroline's smile faltered for a moment before she straightened, brushing invisible dust off her blouse. "Don't get too comfortable. Farm boy. Land in this county has a way of ending up where it belongs." She turned, laughing lightly again as though she hadn't just spit venom into morning air, and sauntered off to a group of friends waiting by the coffee stand. Caleb exhaled slowly. His grandmother's words echoed in his chest. "Keep it steady." He kept working, though his hands trembled just slightly as he arranged more greens on the table. Around him, the air felt heavier. Conversations resumed, but the rhythm had shifted. A few of his customers avoided his eyes now, unwilling to be caught in the orbit of the Whitfield's disdain. Others, mostly black families and a handful of Latino workers, pressed closer to his stand, buying more than they planned, slipping him quiet words of encouragement. Caleb thanked them, each interaction reinforcing the wall he built inside himself against humiliation. He would not let her words lodge in his bones. Still, he felt the unspoken message. In Mason County, wealth wasn't just money. It was a shield, a weapon, a declaration of who belonged and who did not. Across the square, Caroline threw her head back in laughter, her voice carrying above the crowd. Caleb kept his gaze on his work, but deep down, the unease in his chest hardened into something steadier, sharper. He knew storms in Mason County didn't always come with thunder. Sometimes they started with whispers, sneers, a public moment meant to remind you of your place. And sometimes, if you were patient enough, they ended with the ground shifting under the people who thought they owned it. The heat pressed heavier by noon, the kind that made the air shimmer above the pavement and turned tempers brittle. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusted the brim of his hat, and kept working the line of customers that hadn't thinned since morning. He was tired, but in that steady, satisfying way work gave you when you knew every sale meant food on your family's table. The jars of honey were nearly gone, his greens reduced to a few bunches, and he was already thinking of the cornbread he'd share with Ruth that evening, her smile bright as she asked how much he'd sold. That fragile peace broke with the sound of Caroline Whitfield's voice cutting through the market like glass. She was back, her cheeks flushed pink with drink, a half-empty champagne flute wobbling in her hand. A few of her friends trailed behind, laughing too loudly, the kind of laughter meant to draw attention. Caroline staggered toward Caleb's booth, her heels clicking unevenly. Shoppers glanced uneasily at her, then at him, sensing something brewing. Well, she slurred, pointing at Caleb's crates. "Still here? Don't you know this market's for real farmers, not—" She paused for dramatic effect, smirking as she dragged her eyes over his worn shirt, his callous hands. Charity cases. A hush swept over the nearby crowd. Caleb set down the bundle of collards he'd been weighing and straightened his back. "Miss Whitfield, maybe you should let someone drive you home," he said quietly. His voice carried no sharpness, only a firmness, like a man speaking to someone teetering too close to a ledge. Her smirk hardened. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she snapped, her words slurring. She stepped closer, close enough for him to smell the sour tang of alcohol on her breath. "You think because you can sell a few vegetables, you're somebody? You'll never be anything but dirt under our boots. My family owns this county, and don't you forget it." Caleb kept his composure, his face steady as stone. "I don't forget," he said, "but the soil belongs to God, not to you." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, anger, maybe fear. Then she raised her voice, louder, shrill enough to slice through the market noise. "Did you hear that? He threatened me." She staggered back, clutching her chest theatrically. "This man just threatened me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Caleb's chest tightened. "That's not true," he said, his voice calm but urgent now. "I didn't threaten her. Y'all saw." But it was too late. Across the square, 2 sheriff's deputies had already begun moving toward the commotion, their radios crackling. Both men were white, their faces tight with the eagerness of authority called into action. Caleb's stomach dropped as Caroline pointed at him, tears springing suddenly to her eyes, as if she were the victim. "He scared me," she cried. "He said he'd come after me. I don't feel safe." The deputies closed in. Caleb raised his hands instinctively, palms open, not out of guilt but out of survival. The crowd parted, murmurs rising. Some shoppers averted their eyes, unwilling to challenge the Whitfields. Others, mostly black, pulled out phones, recording quickly, understanding what was at stake. Among them was Nia, who had arrived to help him pack up. She held her phone steady, her young face rigid with anger and fear. "Sir, step away from the booth," one deputy ordered, already unclipping his cuffs. Caleb didn't move. "I haven't done anything. Please look at the cameras. Look at the people here. She's drunk." The other deputy grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back before he could finish. Pain shot up his shoulder, but Caleb clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. The produce stand shook as one of the officers shoved him against it, collards spilling to the ground like scattered leaves. Caroline watched from a few feet away, a satisfied smirk tugging at her lips, her earlier tears vanishing as quickly as they come. The cuffs clicked shut. The crowd erupted. Shouts of protest from some, silence from others. Nia's voice rose above them, breaking. "He didn't do anything. I got it on video. Y'all see this, right?" Her phone trembled in her hand, but she kept recording. Caleb closed his eyes, the weight of the cuffs biting into his wrists. Ruth's words echoed again. "Keep it steady." He breathed deep, grounding himself against the humiliation, against the rage clawing in his chest. He would not give them what they wanted. He would not break. As the deputies marched him through the market, children watched wide-eyed, mothers pulled them close, and elders shook their heads with weary recognition. For the people of Mason County, this was not new. It was a script written long before Caleb's time, playing out once again under the southern sun. But this time, something was different. This time it was on camera. This time, the lie wasn't invisible. And Caleb, though shackled, walked with a posture that told everyone watching he would not let this be the end of his story. Ohms would reveal a background or inner strength scene, written with the same cinematic depth. The Mason County jail smelled of bleach and despair, the kind of place designed not just to hold men, but to shrink them. The iron bars clanged shut behind Caleb, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a final gavel strike. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, hands resting calmly on his knees, the steel cuffs still burning faintly in his skin. Across the dimly lit cell, a couple of men eyed him curiously, waiting to see if he'd flinch, if he'd fold. Caleb just breathed steady, his face unreadable. The deputies had paraded him through town like a trophy, heads turning, whispers rising with every step. But now, in the stillness of the cell, Caleb's mind sharpened. He thought of Ruth, how she'd be sitting on the porch with her Bible open, praying but not weeping. He thought of Nia, her young voice cracking with outrage as she recorded every second. And he thought of the Whitfields, how easily they twisted the truth into chains. His jaw tightened, but his heart stayed calm. "Men," one of the inmates finally said, breaking the silence. He was middle-aged, wiry, with a scar running along his cheek. You kept your cool out there. Most folks would have been cussing and spitting. What's your story? Caleb looked up, his eyes steady. I grow food, he said simply. Feed my family. Feed my community. The man chuckled dryly. They don't cuff folks over collard greens. What they really afraid of? Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, letting his silence do the talking. But inside, the truth flickered like firelight. They were afraid because he wasn't just a farmer. Hours passed before footsteps echoed down the corridor. Keys rattled. A deputy appeared, followed by a young black woman in a sharp navy suit, her heels clicking with authority. Her hair was braided neatly down her back, her face set with quiet fury. "Caleb Johnson?" she asked, her voice carrying. He stood, straightening his posture. "Maya Green," he said, almost smiling. The deputy frowned. "You know her?" "She's my lawyer," Caleb replied. Maya handed over paperwork with brisk efficiency. "He's being released. Charges are flimsy, unsupported. You want this on record, or you want to let him walk out quiet?" The deputy grumbled but unlocked the door, muttering under his breath. Once they stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway, Maya turned to Caleb, her voice dropping low. "Nia called me. Sent me the video. I knew the Whitfield were ruthless, but this—" She shook her head, anger simmering in her eyes. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Caleb gave a small nod, his face calm but his voice firm. "They still think I'm just a farmer." Maya studied him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Let them think that. They won't see the rest until it's too late." They stepped outside into the thick night air. Crickets sang from the ditches, and the courthouse clock told the hour. Caleb inhaled deeply, the smell of damp soil grounding him again. The truth was, his life had never fit the Whitfield story of a poor farm boy barely scraping by. Behind the long days in the field, Caleb carried another life entirely. Scholarships had taken him out of Mason County, first to a state university, then to graduate school, where he'd earned degrees in agricultural economics and environmental law. He'd studied the fine print of land deeds, learned how wealth was stolen from black farmers one signature, one forged paper at a time. While others saw him bent over in overalls, he was also a strategist, building towards something larger with every dollar saved, every acre discreetly purchased under LLCs the Whitfields never noticed. It wasn't pride that kept him silent about those degrees. It was strategy. Power grew best in the shadows, where arrogance couldn't see it forming. As Maya drove him home, headlights carving through the dark country road, Caleb gazed out the window at the endless stretch of fields. He saw more than soil. He saw history, blood, and sweat buried deep, but also the seeds of something new. "They humiliated you in front of the whole town," Maya said softly, her voice tight. Caleb shook his head. "No," he said, his tone steady as stone. "They expose themselves. And tomorrow, when the truth comes out, they'll realize I've been building something bigger than their lies." Maya glanced at him, her lawyer's mind already racing. "Then let's make sure the world hears it." And for the first time that night, Caleb let the corner of his mouth lift into a smile, not of joy, but of resolve. The Whitfields thought they'd put him in chains. In reality, they'd just unlocked the door to a reckoning. By morning, Mason County was buzzing. The farmers' market incident had already left whispers hanging in the humid air, but when Nia uploaded the video to her social media overnight, whispers turned to roars. The clip was raw and unshakable. Caroline Whitfield stumbling, her words slurred, calling Caleb a sharecropper's son, then feigning terror as deputies rushed in to cuff him. And there, steady as the earth itself, Caleb stood calm, refusing to lash out even as his booth collapsed around him. The video spread first through the black churches. By dawn, elders were replaying it in fellowship halls, their voices tight with anger, their eyes wet with recognition. "Same as always," one muttered, shaking his head. "They call you a threat, and suddenly you're guilty." But others leaned forward, whispering with a glimmer of hope. "Look at him. Look how steady he stood. That girl caught it all. They can't bury this one." By mid-morning, it had jumped to regional news feeds, then national blogs. Headlines carried phrases like "Heiress targets black farmer," and viral video sparks outrage in small southern town. The Whitfield name, once untouchable, was suddenly coupled with words like racism, privilege, and corruption. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, Ruth beside him, her Bible open though her eyes weren't on the page. Nia hovered over her phone, scrolling furiously, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and exhilaration. They're talking about it in Atlanta. Even in D.C., Caleb. People are reposting your name. Caleb rubbed his palms together, grounding himself. It's not about my name, he said softly. It's about the truth finally breathing in the open. Ruth placed her hand over his, her skin cool, her grip firm. Truth's a dangerous thing in this county, she warned. The Whitfields won't let their name bleed without striking back. As if on cue, the television crackled with a local news report. Caroline's voice rang out in a staged interview, her eyes red-rimmed as she dabbed at them with a tissue. I was terrified, she told the reporter, her tone fragile, trembling. He said things that made me fear for my life. I don't remember everything, but I know I wasn't safe. Behind her sat Judge Whitfield, his hand on her shoulder, his gaze sharp and commanding as he declared that his daughter had been harassed and that Mason County would not tolerate intimidation from agitators. Nia scoffed, throwing her phone down. She's lying right through her teeth. Maya, who had driven down from Atlanta again that morning, crossed her arms. Of course she is. And they'll twist every lever they've got, the sheriff's department, the courts, even the press. Her eyes landed on Caleb. But they're underestimating you. And they don't realize the video already did the damage. Outside, the gravel driveway filled with cars. Neighbors came by in ones and twos. Black families, Latino farmhands, even a handful of poor white farmers who'd long been squeezed by the Whitfield's grocery chain. They stood awkwardly at first, hats in hand. Then one by one pressed envelopes of cash into Caleb's palm, sacks of seed into his porch, jars of preserved fruit onto his table. We got you, they said quietly. Whatever comes next. And then, just before dusk, a white van rolled up and out stepped a woman with a camera crew. She was a reporter from Atlanta's Channel 9. Microphone already clipped to her blouse. Mr. Johnson, she called as she approached, would you be willing to speak on record about what happened yesterday? Caleb hesitated, his instinct pulling him inward, but Maya nodded firmly. This is how we shift the story, she whispered, standing on his own porch. Caleb squared his shoulders. The camera's red light blinked to life. His face filled the frame, calm, grounded, resolute. I didn't threaten anyone, he said clearly. I sell food. I take care of my family. I've worked this land my whole life, and I know what dignity looks like. What happened yesterday wasn't about me threatening her. It was about her trying to remind me, and people like me, of our place. But the truth is, we've always known our place. It's right here, on this land, in this town, and we're not going anywhere. The words were simple, but they rang with a quiet thunder. Across living rooms and church halls, people replayed them, nodding, some wiping tears. For the first time in Mason County's long memory, the Whitfields' word was not gospel. But with every share, every headline, every ripple of support, Caleb knew the storm he was stepping into would only grow darker. The truth was out, but truth had a way of drawing enemies out of the shadows. And the Whitfields were already stirring. Night fell heavy over Mason County, but inside Caleb's farmhouse the light burned late. Papers were spread across the dining table, old deeds yellow with time, copies of land surveys, notarized signatures that bore the faint smudge of fraud. Maya sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, her pen moving quickly across a legal pad. Caleb leaned over the documents, his brow furrowed, his callous fingers tracing the lines of his family's history inked onto brittle paper. Ruth moved quietly between them, setting down mugs of coffee as though fortifying soldiers before battle. This isn't just about Caroline's lies, Maya said, tapping her pen against a deed from 1943. This county's history is written in theft. Your great-grandparents had 40 acres, paid off, registered, and then suddenly transferred to Whitfield Holdings. No sale record, no compensation, just gone. Caleb's jaw clenched. He remembered the stories Ruth used to tell him about her parents, how they'd worked that land until men with badges came one night, telling them it no longer belonged to them. They left with only what they could carry. Caleb had thought those stories were just grief passed down. Now here was the proof. They've been doing this for generations, Maya continued, her voice tightening. Black families across the county. Intimidation, forged documents, crooked judges. And your family wasn't the only one. She turned her laptop toward him. On the screen was a map dotted with parcels of land. Each name once belonging to a black family, each now stamped with the Whitfield brand. Caleb exhaled slowly, steadying himself. And nobody ever fought it. Some tried, Maya said, her eyes heavy. But without evidence, without money, without a system willing to listen, they were crushed. She closed the laptop. But now we have something different. We have video. We have public attention. And we have you. Somebody who's not just working the land, but who's already quietly buying it back. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents Caleb had signed under different LLCs. Pieces of land he'd been purchasing for years, acre by acre, with money he'd saved and pooled from co-op investments. Maya looked at him with a kind of wonder. Do you realize what you've done, Caleb? You own over 300 acres, nearly all bordering Whitfield property. Ruth, who had been quiet until now, let out a low laugh that was equal parts pride and disbelief. The boy done outsmarted them while they weren't even looking. Caleb kept his eyes on the papers, his voice calm. It wasn't about outsmarting. It was about waiting, about building something real. So when the time came, we'd be ready. He paused, looking up at Maya. Is the time here? Maya's gaze held his. The time's here. The next days blurred into strategy. Caleb and Maya drove from house to house, meeting elders who remembered when the Whitfields' reach was first stretched by lies. Some were hesitant, fearful of speaking out after so many years of silence. But when Caleb sat across from them, his presence quiet and unshakable, they opened their doors, pulling boxes of old papers from attics, photographs from trunks, ledgers written in faded ink. Every piece was another nail in the Whitfields' coffin. Meanwhile, Maya contacted journalists she trusted, sending them carefully curated pieces of evidence. The story widened. Generations of black land stolen in Mason County. The word stung like salt in the wound of the nation's history, and suddenly the Whitfields were no longer a wealthy family with influence. They were a symbol of everything broken in America's promise. The Whitfields retaliated fast. Anonymous threats slipped under Caleb's door. Deputies slowed their cars as they passed his farm at night. Caroline herself appeared on another news program, her voice brittle with anger now instead of tears. This is a witch hunt, she snapped. My family built this county, and we won't let outsiders destroy it. But the ground was shifting beneath her feet. In the courthouse, Maya filed the first lawsuit, a claim for fraudulent land transfer on behalf of the Johnson family, with more cases promised to follow. Each document was clean, airtight, backed by history and evidence no judge could dismiss without scrutiny. The sheriff scowled as they walked past his office, but Caleb didn't flinch. He moved like a man carrying not just his own fight, but generations of unfinished battles. That night, standing at the edge of his fields, Caleb looked out at the horizon. The air smelled of damp earth, rich and full of promise. He thought of his father's calloused hands, his grandmother's prayers, his sister's fiery voice. He thought of every ancestor who had bent over soil they could never claim, and he whispered into the night, almost a prayer, almost a vow, this land is ours. The town hall overflowed with bodies that night. 100 years of silence pressed into one small room. The Whitfields had called the meeting themselves, expecting to reclaim control, to quiet the growing storm with charm and intimidation. But when the people arrived, black families in Sunday clothes, young organizers with cameras in their hands, white farmers who had grown uneasy with what they'd been seeing, it was clear the balance had shifted. The air itself felt charged, heavy with expectation. Caroline Whitfield sat near the front, her pearl necklace glinting under the fluorescent lights, her smile brittle and rehearsed. Sheriff Darnell leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes sweeping the crowd like he owned it. A row of county commissioners shuffled papers, trying to mask their unease. Then Caleb walked in. He wasn't in his work clothes tonight. He wore a dark suit, plain but sharp, one his father had been buried in. His shoulders filled the doorway, his presence commanding silence without force. Ruth walked beside him, steadying her cane but holding her head high. Behind them came Maya, carrying a thick stack of files like a weapon that couldn't be hidden. The room hushed as Caleb took his seat at the microphone. He rested his hands on the wood of the podium, fingers spread wide, as though he was grounding himself in the very grain of the table. For a moment, he just looked at the people. Faces of neighbors who had known him since he was a boy. Faces of elders who remembered his grandmother singing in the fields. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. My family has been in Mason County for over 100 years. We worked this land. We built it. And for 100 years, we were told we didn't own what we had already paid for. He held up a deed. The paper yellowed fragile. This is proof. My great-grandparents' land, stolen in 1943. And here, he lifted another sheet, is the so-called transfer document, signed by a judge already under investigation for bribery. The ink's the same, the signature's forged. This isn't just my story. This is a story of dozens of families in this room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Caroline's smile tightened. Maya stepped forward, sliding folders across the commissioner's desk. Every document has been notarized and entered into evidence. Every testimony recorded. What you see here isn't rumor. It's fact. It's theft carried out over generations, sanctioned by those in this very building. The sheriff pushed off the wall. This is slander, he barked, his voice rising. You don't come into this hall and accuse good people of crimes without. But his words were cut short by a voice from the back. Old Mrs. Johnson stood, her frail body shaking, but her voice carrying strong. That was our land, too. My daddy tried to fight, and they threw him in jail. Don't you dare call this slander. More voices rose, some angry, some trembling, but all insistent. Names were spoken, dates remembered, losses laid bare. It wasn't just Caleb's truth anymore. It was the whole community's. Caroline stood abruptly, her pearls catching the light as though they might shield her. This is an ambush, she snapped. My family gave jobs. We built this town. And you, her eyes locked on Caleb, cold with disdain. You were nothing but a farmer's son, and you think you can rewrite history? Caleb's gaze didn't waver. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice carrying calm power. I don't have to rewrite history, Caroline. History wrote itself. We're just bringing it out of the shadows. Then, from the side of the room, a young journalist lifted his phone high. Live stream already rolling. The world's watching, he called out. Caroline faltered just for a second. Her composure cracked as the weight of eyes beyond Mason County pressed in. Maya placed one final folder on the commissioner's desk. And here, she said, is the list of LLCs, companies Mr. Caleb Ellis owns. As of last month, he has legally acquired over 300 acres of farmland, including parcels adjacent to Whitfield Holdings. By next season, he will own more land in this county than any other family, including the Whitfields. The silence that followed was electric. Caroline's face drained of color. Sheriff Darnell shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware the cameras recording every twitch of his jaw. Caleb looked out over the crowd, his voice soft but unshakable. We're not here to destroy. We're here to reclaim, to build what was ours and what will be our children's. The soil remembers. And now, so does the law. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Not wild, but steady, like waves hitting a shore that had waited too long. Elders clapped slowly, tears on their cheeks. Young men and women raised their fists, not in anger, but in solidarity. And in that moment, under the harsh lights of the town hall, the power that had once seemed untouchable cracked open for all to see. The morning after the town hall, Mason County felt different. The air itself carried a quiet tension, as if the soil beneath the streets was exhaling after decades of holding its breath. Newspapers had already printed the story. Regional stations played the footage on repeat, and the live stream had spread across the country overnight. People who had never heard of Mason County now knew its history, its theft, its silence, and now it's reckoning. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did. Habit had him pulling on work boots, even though his suit from last night still hung over the back of a chair. He stepped out into the field, the earth damp from morning dew, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was trespassing on his own land. The rows stretched wide in front of him, the horizon painted in soft strokes of lavender and gold. His chest filled, heavy and light all at once. Behind him, Ruth shuffled slowly onto the porch, wrapped in her shawl. She looked at her grandson standing out there, framed by the sunrise, and for a moment she saw his father's shadow, tall, steady, stubborn. She pressed her hand against her heart and whispered a prayer, not of asking this time, but of thanks. Later that day, neighbors came, first a trickle, then more. Some brought food, others came empty-handed, but all came with words they had swallowed for too long. Old stories poured out like water. Names of fathers jailed for standing up, deeds snatched away in courtrooms, acres lost lives. For the first time, they weren't just mourning together. They were planning. Maya stood in the center, organizing folders, already fielding calls from attorneys who wanted to join their case. The legal fight was far from over. The Whitfields and their allies wouldn't surrender easily, but the tide had turned. Truth wasn't a whisper in Mason County anymore. It was a floodlight. At the church that Sunday, the pews overflowed. Voices rose in song, rich and trembling, every note carrying both grief and triumph. The preacher's words weren't about vengeance, but about restoration. "The Lord does not forget," he said, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder. "And neither will this town." Even those who had stayed silent in the past, the farmers who once shook hands with the Whitfields, the store owners who looked the other way, now came forward, uneasy but willing. The power that had bound them in fear was broken, its cracks too wide to patch. Caroline Whitfield's face still appeared on the local paper, but no longer in reverence. Her name was now tied to investigations, audits, and hearings. Sheriff Darnell avoided the streets, the weight of scrutiny hanging over him like a shadow. The institutions that once seemed immovable now trembled, forced to answer for years of silence. For Caleb, the transformation wasn't only public. It was deeply personal. He found himself walking the land differently, each step carrying both memory and promise. He thought of his father, who never lived to see this day, and of his grandmother, who had fought with nothing but prayer and perseverance. Now, standing at the edge of the field, Caleb bent down, running his hands through the soil. He whispered to the earth, to them, to himself, "We're home." Months later, a sign went up at the entrance to the property, Ellis Farms, family-owned since 1921. Children from the community played in the fields, elders gathered on porches, and laughter carried across the land that had once been a wound. It wasn't the end of the fight, far from it, but it was a beginning. And as the seasons turned, Mason County began to change. The soil, the people, the truth, they were all connected, each one remembering what had been stolen and what had been reclaimed. The story didn't close with the Whitfields' downfall or the applause at Town Hall. It closed here, in the quiet strength of a family walking their land with dignity restored, in a community no longer bowed, and in the knowledge that justice, though slow, had finally come home. The camera would linger on Caleb standing in the field at dusk, the last light wrapping him in gold, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Not a man broken by history, but one who carried it forward. The screen would fade to black on a single line. The soil remembers, and so do we.